right, welcome folks. We're going to cover a very interesting topic. There's been quite a bit of discussion on LinkedIn with regard to the single pivotal trial default standard that FDA had published in NEJM on the 18th of February 2026. So I have with me today Sean Moylan. Sean has held leadership positions where he led global regulatory teams across US, Europe, and Asia Pacific. He brings deep expertise in strategy for both pharmaceutical and biologic products, as well as extensive cross-functional project leadership. He's known for combining strong strategic thinking with practical industry insight. So welcome, Sean. I'm so glad to have you today.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate the kind words. I always enjoy getting together with former colleagues and current friends. So I appreciate you having me on today.
Thank you, Sean. Let's dive into it. On the 18th of February 2026, FDA, more specifically the CBER head and the FDA commissioner, published an essay in NEJM. It was titled One Pivotal Trial, the New Default Option for FDA Approval, ending the two-trial dogma. And that's a very interesting choice of words, don't you think? I've not read something like that, I don't know, in this sort of...
In a scientific journal is what you're saying. You're absolutely right. Yeah. I think when you reached out to discuss this topic and shared the article, I read it as well. My knee-jerk reaction was, this is crazy, right? There's no way that the gold standard is going to be a single trial when almost every compound out there, save a few, and the FDA has always allowed for exceptions through some of their pathways, but to now look at this as the gold standard for developers to follow, again, it's not in an official guidance or an official documentation that's been endorsed, but I think that the knee-jerk reaction probably by most people in industry was, this doesn't seem right. Where's the scientific rigor? Where's all of the stuff that my company needed to do to get our products on the market? And now basically that's not really warranted any longer. That can't be. There's a lot of questions that are raised based off of someone even insinuating that this is going to be the way in which you're going to get something developed and on the market.
Yes, and that's why I was excited to get you and talk about both sides of the thinking here. It said this sounding board announces a new FDA policy that the default requirement for FDA approvals will be one robust pivotal trial. I'm curious, from what we know, when there is a policy change, there needs to be feedback, a window, a process step. Is this something completely within the gambit of the FDA? How does that work? Can you just share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always a period in which new guidances or new policies are placed out for comment, whether it be industry comment, public comment. It's an opportunity for people outside of the agency to opine on whatever they're proposing, the legitimacy, the positives, the flaws that can be considered prior to issuing this new policy or guidance. This is the reason so many people were skeptical or up in arms about why this is just being published in a reputable journal. And they noticed that this period hadn't occurred. And that's what's raising all these questions. Should we be now starting to build strategy around this? And it's likely that the FDA is going to say, oh, we put that out there, so now we're going to abide by it. Or once it gets into the reviewers' hands that are responsible for signing off on this, are they all of a sudden going to have a divergent opinion and say, this is not in line with my belief in what you've proven or disproven because I don't think the rigor is there. So there may be some intra-agency issues that come out of this. And there's other divisions, there's other leaders within the FDA that may not exactly agree with this philosophy either. But they did leave themselves a little bit of room. It's not saying that this is mandated or this is going to be successful all of the time. This is the starting point at which companies should be approaching the agency and thinking about how they want to develop a compound moving forward.
Yeah. In fact, I came across an interesting post by an FDA expert. He mentions that the expectation of two trials has largely been an agency policy framework and that developed over time by the US FDA risk mitigation approach, and it's not a statutory mandate. So I was hoping to talk about statutory versus a policy framework and how much of leeway, flexibility is there.
Yeah. If you look at the Code of Federal Regulations, it doesn't say two studies. So, to your point, it's the guidance that the FDA provides that has always interpreted two studies as meeting the overall suggestion that it's substantial evidence that's required. And they felt confirmatory, well controlled studies is the way to ensure that one study wasn't missing key information via outcomes, population, dose response, whatever it may be, that they weren't missing something in the critical design of that trial. And so having a confirmatory study doesn't necessarily mean exactly the same study. The purpose of those two is to confirm that the safety and efficacy profile of the product you want to put into people has been thoroughly flushed out, and that you feel confident in the statistical analysis, in the safety profile, and overall the benefit risk. So that's why the default has always been two trials. There have been products approved on one trial because there's been thorough analysis within the phase 2 program, let's say, of the dose response relationship, and therefore you can extrapolate out what your dose is that you're testing and that it's adequate and safe. So there have been instances like that. It's just now, do we want to rely on that as the starting point?
The starting paragraph says, since 1997, the FDA had retained the statutory authority to grant marketing authorizations based on a single, adequate, well-controlled study in combination with confirmatory evidence. And then they go on to write, this approach is a model that provides flexibility, and that this flexibility is not new and has been relied upon a number of times.
Right.
And the flexibility remained an FDA prerogative activated by specific case representation by the industry.
Yeah, I think the goal, Jacob, is to highlight this particular path in hopes that if sponsors fully embrace it and they engage with the agency as often as they can, you can work through the details of what this development program looks like and can actually institute a one study philosophy or strategy. And that's a big question mark too, because the agency isn't always open or as flexible when it comes to granting meetings as a sponsor may hope. And that's even with a well-designed, developed, and thoroughly assessed compound. When they're getting towards the end of their clinical phases, that's when it's most important that you have the agency's ears, and the agency wants to see all of that data to have a robust conversation. Now, what they're saying is you may be able to have less of that and come to us. We can develop a really thorough and deep protocol that's going to enable you to register your compound with only one trial. So that's going to entail much more detailed conversations, engagements more often. This isn't just the FDA. If this is something your company is adopting, you're going to want to adhere to that for the other regions as well. In order to mitigate any risk, you're going to want to go to their agencies. So it's putting a lot of pressure on the sponsors and specifically regulatory folks to come with that strategy saying, look, we have the backing of the agencies. To the statisticians, we can tell you exactly how you have to design this trial, what the numbers are. And to the clinicians, this is the outcomes that they are going to adhere to. And if you're able to meet your endpoints here, you're going to have a registerable compound. So I think it does put a lot of pressure now back on the sponsors. The hopes is you can develop compounds quicker, which may or may not be the case, right? And you're going to get them on the market. You're going to do it cheaper because you don't have as many studies to run. A big phase 3 trial is $30 to $50 million or something. So you're going to pass that savings on to the patients.
That's a big topic.
And so there's a lot of things that need to be tackled in order for that to come to fruition. But in the end, there may be some issue that the reviewer sees, and then they say, well, we'd really like to see another trial. And all of that work may have been for naught. Or we're going to put on this really detailed and time-consuming post-marketing review and assessment that it's going to be expensive on the back end. And so, yeah, you may have saved money in the development of the compound up front because you only had to run that clinical, but now you're going to be pushing a lot of money into the back end of your development and post-approval review.
That's true. And you raise some really important points. So there is the evidence that comes from the trials. And confirmatory evidence, instead of being relied upon from a second trial, can come from mechanistic science, data from related indication, animal models, information from other drugs, real world evidence, which can be given equal weightage as a second adequate, well controlled study. Now, I think the question here is, did the needle move on all these other aspects of confirmatory evidence in the last 30 years? Because the article starts by saying in these 3 decades, a massive shift has happened in how confirmatory evidence can be weighed into decision making. There is some merit to it, right?
I've had recent experience with this, and I have 2 points to make. One is with real world evidence. I think the agency has been saying that they will consider determining whether an application supported by that evidence is adequate or not, right? We may want to say, especially for products that have been marketed, they have a lot of real world evidence. So they can sift through to say you have overwhelming data to support what you want to do in a trial, right? Or what you want to do as far as your label is concerned, because that's a lot of where the real world evidence has been applied. Because you're saying, look, we recognize we had this outcome in our clinical trials, we had to report it, but now we've made changes to our manufacturing, changes to our device, and we don't feel this is representative of our product any longer. Here's all of the data that we've had and we've accumulated over the years. We feel you can draw the same conclusion that we have, and we'd like to modify the label as such so we can promote it. So I think that's been the agency's desire. You have this discussion with them to decide what's your real world evidence protocol going to look like, which health records are you going to pull from, what databases, how are you going to sift it, and ultimately what are you going to present in the package to support this. But there's inherent flaws with real world evidence. There's lack of specificity in certain areas, and so you're making some assumptions sometimes. On the other hand, what they're suggesting is that this is going to be the way of the future, because you now have AI that's going to continue to build upon itself. And if those AI tools are more reliable, can gather that data more quickly, more efficiently, effectively identify where the discrepancies are and what the flaws of the data are, the sponsor and the agency can then address those specific things and get to the point where they say we need other confirmatory evidence, or we can dismiss this as one-offs. And they can do that much more quickly than we can today. So I think there's the old way, which is from the late 90s, all the flaws and all the data mining and the hours that it would take to get that real world evidence to show a confirmatory data compared to your clinical trial, versus where that data is going to be much stronger, much more robust and reliable than what we've seen before. And therefore, it could, in effect, demonstrate confirmatory evidence to a clinical trial.
I'm glad you brought up the use of artificial intelligence. I believe there could be a lot of debate as an industry, especially, and how we should deploy it. So, Sean, if we step back, this seems to be more about how much scientific certainty we can now generate upfront. Historically, we needed 2 trials because our biological understanding was limited. So, replication acted as a safety net. But today, FDA is claiming that gap is narrowing. With AI and advances in translational science, we can demonstrate target engagement in humans, understand mechanisms at a systems level, and track pharmacodynamic effects over time. More importantly, we can connect all of this into a coherent story from molecule to clinical outcome. So the topic seems broader than the 1 or 2 trial. It's whether the totality of evidence is strong enough, stating that if the mechanistic package is robust, one well-designed study may be sufficient. If not, additional trials are still needed. So FDA's argument is that this isn't lowering the bar, it's raising the expectation on the quality of evidence. Another point that was made about type 1 errors. The second trial is an effort to eliminate false positives. So if the first trial had shown favorable data, the second one you don't get as lucky. By bringing confirmatory evidence through other means and not through a second trial, how are we going to handle the false positive? That somehow to me did not come together in the article, because it came back to the point that today's capabilities build a more comprehensive biologic story.
Your point is well made. The decision as to whether or not that can be used to substitute clinical data is going to fully depend on the robustness and the rigor of the way in which that data was collated, assessed, and presented. And ultimately by the individual that's reviewing it. That person is going to have to weigh the evidence as strongly as they would a clinical trial evidence and say, I believe this represents the compound's safety or efficacy profile to the degree that the clinical trial would have given me confidence. So in today's world, there's going to be a hesitancy from people to believe that you can replace clinical trial data and observation with something that's garnered through AI or a database or other information. And I think that's where we have a lot of divergent thinking from maybe a regulatory perspective to a clinical perspective to a safety perspective. And I've been involved with these conversations. The clinician feels as though it's fine, but you're telling them from a regulatory perspective, it's probably not going to fly because of your experiences in the past. The statistician can argue it. And safety says, I don't know, it doesn't really seem to be passing my test either. And so you have these inner team discussions on what the successful application is going to look like. And I think this is just going to fuel that argument in the future when more dependency is being placed on non-clinical data. So to me, success is always once you've engaged the agency and it comes out with an approval on the back end. That's the experience that we want to leverage. And we haven't had that yet with AI generated data and some of these other ways in which we can collect information to the degree that they're saying we should rely on it moving forward with this one trial design.
Yeah. But when we talk about safety, I need a larger data set clinically.
Prior to approval is what you're talking about. Yeah, there's a reason we run clinical trials. And if it's data mining available data on the market from other compounds, how applicable is it for your mechanism of action or your treatment type or your delivery type? And again, is that database large enough for you to accept the risk benefit? Because, ultimately the onus is on the reviewers to say, this is approved. You've demonstrated that this new compound has undergone a significant non-clinical trials to get it into a clinical trial. We've discussed the clinical trial. The outcomes are what we expected. The safety profile appears to be consistent with what we expected. And you have all this other evidence that you've collected on not the exact compound, but similar compounds that we feel this package now is approvable. And that you can actually market this and place this into humans. That benefit, risk, safety, and efficacy onus still falls on the agency. And so the question for me is, are they in a position now to accept what this article is insinuating, which is they should be, right? Mm-hmm. They should be in a position to do that. So the pressure is on industries to develop it faster, develop it cheaper, pass all of that on to the patients. But until the agency shows us that they're willing to accept that and then put it onto the market, not risking patient safety, it's kind of going to be hard for that first group to just start from scratch as using this as their guide and moving forward without worrying that in the end, the agency may do a 180 and say, we really do need more clinical confirmation here.
Yes. The big question in forums is this. So what considerations should sponsors prioritize in a single pivotal trial to ensure that it supports filings across multiple regions?
Yeah. So, the easy answer, Jacob, is that there's less reliance on what the FDA perspective is for drug development. around the world. So I think the other agencies are much more independent now. More of the sophisticated agencies, especially, want to have their own input, insight, discussions on how they feel you should develop your compound for their particular population. And so I think that when you start going down the road of testing into your phase 2, or you've got your safety and you want to test proof of concept and dose ranging, this is when you should start thinking about your next step, which is what are we going to do if in fact our phase 2 is successful? Discussing that with the team and starting to engage agencies on their appetite for accepting data out there that can be used as supportive evidence. I mean, if you're developing something that there's not a lot of evidence that can be garnered from outside of a clinical trial, obviously you're more limited in what your strategy is. But, if you start to get to a point where you're having discussions from a clinical strategic perspective, what you want to demonstrate for your regulatory filing, then of course you're going to want to start not only engaging the FDA, since they were the ones to kickstart this, but then taking it to EMA and PMDA and some of the other agencies around the world. Look, this is our strategy. Here's the evidence we propose to provide to you, where you can allude to the fact that you're having discussions with the FDA and utilize that as a springboard in your conversations. But ultimately, I don't think you're going to have that sense of quote unquote security in your strategy until you have garnered feedback from those other agencies. So to summarize, don't just go to the US and say, okay, you've placed this as the new gold standard, this single trial. This is what we'd like to pursue. Here's all of our evidence. And they say, okay, and then you just adopt that for the rest of the world. That's no longer adequate. And I've seen that in programs prior to this being rolled out, where we propose maybe less clinical data than is supported through the guidances. We feel we have complementary data or supportive evidence that we don't need to demonstrate a full, robust clinical program that's traditionally been provided. A lot more pressure is going to be put on regulatory folks, to be honest. When things like this come out, the first thing that all the supportive groups are going to do is come to your group meeting and say, well, great. I just saw this news. We only have to do one trial and you make it happen.
Yeah. If EMA and PMDA are continuing as they have always done, we are talking about multiple dossier bills.
It's going to be going back. If you've been in the industry long enough, you've seen the cyclical way of approaching drug development worldwide. First, it was build individual dossiers to meet certain requirements from an IP perspective. You want to make sure that this market's getting their stuff, this market, but they're all getting different dossiers, basically. And then we morphed to, well, let's just do one dossier. And if they can accept it, they should accept it. And we can cut out certain specific information for these markets, but they'll accept what we give them because we've built it off of this one market. Now we're kind of going back to, well, if the FDA says this and we don't agree with them, then obviously you're going to have to build us a dossier too. And it's going to be specific for us. So yeah, this is going to be the dilemma that I think sponsors, regulatory folks, and R&D teams are going to have to deal with moving forward. Where's that fine line that cuts through all of the regions that you can satisfy all of their needs in that one big trial? Or can you convince them that the supportive evidence that is going to supplement the trial will meet their needs? And that's where all of the discussions are going to have to take place.
Yes. EMA also does accept single trial, but it always comes with a commitment to do post-op study.
And not just single trials. I mean, there's, even with dual trial approvals, there's PMCs. Again, it depends on the data package that's presented and any outstanding queries that the agency feels are open that aren't prohibiting an approval, but warrant having the sponsor gather additional information through post-marketing commitments. We've seen that historically with many compounds where you're required to submit on a quarterly or a half-yearly basis a report that summarizes what you're seeing in the safety database. So I think that's nothing new, but it may become more onerous on the sponsors when it comes to supporting a single trial. The back end now has to be more developed, more efficient in data gathering, reporting to the standard that is going to substitute the clinical data. And so I think
Yes.
that's the full circle.
And also, there's no room for error. It's not like we leave room for error, but in a practical world, when we run a large trial, every point has to be met. Every assumption that you begin with, there's no margin when we are
Right.
looking at a single trial
That's right.
execution as well.
That's
So,
right.
in a way, it's burdensome. But once again, if we combine it with AI bringing up our ability to run with lesser errors, that's something.
I think that
Mhm.
with the way I see AI building upon itself and testing itself, it's both exciting and a little scary at the same time, because the reliance is going to be something that you're going to be forced to accept in some cases, and they may not be comfortable with that. I think that's going to be the future. It's been here a little bit already, but I think it's going to increase. We talked about utilizing AI to develop or generate modules, module 2 information, module 1 information, where it could read reports that are coming from our departments and summarize them and place them right into the module. So
Yeah.
I can see AI being utilized more and more, but where it crosses over to now being execution related versus doing data collection and analysis and coming to conclusions, that's going to be the part that's going to be a little uneasy.
Right. Some great points there, Sean. What would be some final thoughts in terms of advice to organizations right now? Do we speak into strategy, or should we wait up and discuss more within the industry, cross regulator, cross companies, cross countries to come up with a plan?
I would say to my team that this is not something brand new, right?
Yeah.
That the one study designed clinical trial for supporting a submission, an NDA or a BLA, has always been something the FDA has considered. It's been part of their accelerated pathway. This is just highlighting that more conversation should be had with the agency early on in the development process to see the viability in pursuing this type of strategy rather than the more traditional, too well-controlled clinical trial strategy. The positives, negatives, and whether ultimately you want your leadership team and your internal team to endorse that as the going forward, because all your timing is going to be dependent on that now. All your agency engagements is going to be around this one trial philosophy to properly advise our teams.
I think those are some great points. And I like a comment on LinkedIn which talked about regulatory flexibility should not be just based on number of trials, because we all know you can't just say a single trial, two trial, or three trial is a standard. It's really about the data that we need in order to feel assured about the drug.
Yeah.
And sometimes the data can come from one trial that is sufficient, or you will need multiple trials. Sometimes you just need more parameters. Also, we need to discuss how to handle global development and other agencies, what their expectations would be. And
Yeah, when you're talking
exactly, I
about
think that's
global
very well said.
development, you need
Yeah.
to start pulling in your commercial folks and your manufacturing folks. Is this therapeutic area worldwide robust and frequent, or is this an isolated disease happening only in this particular region? So, regulatory strategy takes into consideration where the demand is, where the patients are, and that's going to highly influence what you decide to do with clinical trial design and strategy, because you may come to a market that doesn't believe in one strategy philosophy and wants you to do two trials, and that's the priority market. So you may wind up having different filing strategies based off of what regions you're going to in that case. Yeah, strategy always is very interesting. You may pursue that one single trial strategy because you can do it more quickly. You can get a dossier built and get it to that priority market, and then decide afterwards if you want to do another trial to support other markets, right? Like Asia Pacific in particular, your registration trials may not have included enough patients within some of those markets to make it applicable for an application. And therefore, you do a small trial later within that market or within that region in order to meet the needs of that region. So it may be similar in this case too with a 1 versus 2 trial.
So on that note, it looks like we were able to cover quite a bit on this topic on single trial notification from FDA leadership.
I think we've covered a lot of the thought processes that will go on in the background with some companies or with individuals alike. And hopefully, this enables them to just tune in and hear from a couple of other regulators as to what our concerns are and where we feel it may actually benefit and what risks there are to a
That's right.
policy such as this.
That's right. Well, this topic is not going to stop here. I'm sure there's going to be continued discussion. It has triggered a lot of arguments. We'll see where it goes in the coming days. So,
Yeah.
looking forward to more conversations like this, Sean. I appreciate your time. Thank you for
Me as
being
well.
here.
Thank you, Jacob, for having me. I appreciate it. And I look forward to the series coming out.
Thank you. Have a good
All
one.
right. Take care.